Hello. This chapter will review some previous concepts we learned about server-side code processing. And we'll talk about some cool things you can do with ASP.NET and client-side code. Let's go. We define ASP.NET as a declarative model of server-side controls. It is also possible to use client-side scripting, like JavaScript, which is code that runs in the browser at the client computer. Neither approach is better than the other. But whether you choose server or client code depends on what you want to do. The web world that I've described previously was a world in which all the processing is done by the server, and the client browser just does an interpretation of HTML. Sounds like a nice world, but it is just not realistic. Have you ever spent a lot of time filling out a long form online? Then at the end, you click the submit button and wait a long time for a response? Sounds familiar? That is because the web server is spending a lot of time going through all your responses and verifying that you didn't leave any blanks or enter in any incorrect information. This process takes a lot of time, especially if the web server has to do this for all its users. Fortunately, there is a more efficient way to process this. Client-side scripting was created to give the browser the capability to do an interpretation of client code, not only HTML. This kind of browser code is called script. Using client-side script, the browser can actually do all the form validation before sending it to the server. The user won't need to wait for the server to verify that the form was filled out correctly. His browser can automatically alert him of any mistakes before he sends it off to the server to be processed. As well as efficiency, client-side scripting also allows designers to introduce new ways to enrich the user experience online through interactive web pages. So all our problems are solved, right? Wrong. This actually creates a chaotic environment. Now, browsers need to support different client scripts, and website designers need to create many different versions of their sites to make sure they work with all the different browsers in the market. In the next slide we'll see how ASP.NET deals with this. As I mentioned, the web server doing everything eliminates the chaos on the client. But it is not the most practical or efficient solution in every case. Let us look at some scenarios when creating web applications. Intranet. An intranet inside a company is a very controlled scenario, in where people use a specific version of a browser. The other scenario is Internet, where you can be sure what browsers employees are using and what kinds of client devices they are using. The Internet, on the other hand, is wide open. Users are from all over the world and use a multitude of different browsers with different capabilities. For this scenario, It would be easiest to make everything server-side, because then you don't need to worry about the client browsers. ASP.NET has the capability to do everything on the server side, but also supports certain client-side scripting. ASP.NET has the ability to create client-side scripts for some controls, based on the current user's browser. ASP.NET takes this even further by checking what kind of machine or device the current user is using. Now people can use a PC, a laptop, a smartphone, a pocket PC, and many other types of devices to access a web page. And ASP.NET will supply the appropriate code to fit that device. Now Petey is going to show you an example of this using validation controls.
Hello, and welcome to this demo. We will be looking at ways to validate or verify data fields on a web page. The name of this page is Validator's Demo. It contains a table with fields for user input. Let me add some text box controls from the toolbox. Now I will add a couple of HTML elements for the password. You can find HTML controls in the toolbox under the HTML category. Yes. Let me pick the text input instead of the password input for demo purposes. So we can see what we're typing. Now let's add a button and run the page. As you can see, it's possible to leave the form blank and still submit it to the server. This is not something we want. So let's fix it. In order to validate all the fields on this form, I need to use a special kind of server control called validation controls. In Visual Web Developer Express Edition, you can find these controls in the toolbox under the validation category. First, I want to make sure that the user fills out all the fields. So, to do that, I need to use a required field validator control. First, let me give my text box controls a more descriptive name. Nick. Email. Now just drag the required field validator control over to my page. Let's go into the Properties window for this control and specify which control I want to validate. In this case, I want to validate the Nick text box control. OK. Now let's insert some text to indicate to the user that this is a required field. It's generally accepted that a star asterisk indicates a required field. And let's also specify an error message property. Let's save and view in the browser. Now try clicking the button without filling in the Nick field. Oops. I get the star symbol asterisk telling me that this is a required field. We'll need to add the required field validator controls to each field in this form. But I will save this as an exercise for you to do on your own. Now let me show you some other validation controls. Let's look at the email field. We need to make sure that the user types in a correct email address. First, let's add a required field validator control to make sure the field isn't left blank, and set all the appropriate properties. Then I will add the regular Expressione validator control. Yes. In the Properties window, I need to specify the control to validate. And the kind of expression to validate. Validation expression property. Let's choose Internet email address. Let's save and test in the browser. First, let's try filling in the Nick field but not the email. Yes. Good, that works. We get the asterisk indicating this is a required field. Now let's fill in an incorrect email address. George. Let's look at one more validation control. The compare validator control. I will use it for the password field to make sure that the user types the same password in both fields. Keep in mind that in real life, these fields would not be clear text, so users would not always know if they typed the same password in twice. The ASP.NET validation controls only work with server controls. And remember that the password fields are HTML controls. So we need to convert these HTML elements to server controls. Just right-click over the HTML control and choose Run as Server Control. And let's also change the control name. PWD1. PWD2. Now let's drag the compare validator control over to our page and set its properties. We need to specify the control to validate. In this case, it's the password confirmation text box control. And we also need to specify the control to compare it to. We set this to the first password text box control. Finally, we should set the text message property. Now let's see this in action. Cool stuff. These validation controls are server controls, so you would think that they are only doing stuff on the server side. But in fact they are working on the client side too. Let's look in the Properties window. Under Behavior, there's a property called Enable Client Script. Setting that value to true means that these controls can appear as client-side script and actually do validation within the client's browser. This means more efficient processing and better performance. But if the browser or client device doesn't support client script, that's okay too. All the validation will occur on the server side. As an exercise, try using the validation summary control. This control shows a summary of all the validation messages that you have set in the error message property for each validation control on the page. The summary can appear on the page or in a pop-up window. Another exercise you may want to try is to add a regular expression validator control to the age field, requiring that the user input numbers only. And you can also modify the password field input control to hide the password text. In the source view, look for the password field and change the type from text to password. Okay, now let's go to the browser. C I
Welcome back. Come with me to the final slide. See you later.